Natalie Brooks sat in her aging Honda Civic, staring at the community center entrance like it might suddenly transform into something less intimidating. 24 days had passed since she had closed the doors of Enchanted Moments event planning for the last time. 24 days of sleepless nights, mounting bills, and a shame so deep it felt like drowning. At 29, she was supposed to be building her empire, not watching it crumble because of one disastrous wedding that had gone viral for all the wrong reasons. The video had spread like wildfire across social media. Her biggest client's dream wedding, the one that was supposed to launch her into the upper tier of event planning, collapsed when the venue ceiling partially gave way during the ceremony. Nobody was hurt, thank goodness. But the footage of screaming guests and Natalie's horrified face had been viewed over 2 million times. The lawsuits came swiftly, followed by the cancellations. Then, the bankruptcy filing. A desperate search for understanding. She glanced at her phone again. Reviewing the support group description she had found during a midnight internet search. Fresh starts and new beginnings. It promised a safe space for people rebuilding their lives after professional setbacks. The website had been simple, almost amateur, which now struck her as odd. But desperation had made her overlook the details, taking a breath that caught painfully in her chest. Natalie grabbed her canvas tote bag and stepped out of the car. The October wind whipped her dark hair across her face as she walked toward the building. Inside, the community center smelled of lemon cleaner and old books. A volunteer pointed her toward room 7, and she followed the signs down a hallway decorated with cheerful posters about community programs. The moment of confusion through the narrow window in the door. She saw a circle of chairs, most occupied by people who looked as uncomfortable as she felt. Natalie slipped inside quietly and took an empty seat near the back. The woman next to her, perhaps in her 50s, with kind eyes, offered a small smile that Natalie tried to return. Margaret Foster, the coordinator, stood at the front of the room with a warm presence that immediately put some people at ease. She began welcoming everyone and explaining the purpose of their gathering. As Margaret spoke about healing from wedding-related trauma, about the pain of canceled ceremonies and broken promises, Natalie felt her stomach drop. This was not a professional support group. This was for people whose weddings had ended in disaster. She had clicked the wrong link, joined the wrong meeting. Her face flushed hot with embarrassment. Leaving now would cause a scene, draw attention she desperately wanted to avoid. She would sit quietly, she decided, leave at the first break. Speaking the unspoken truth, but then Margaret was looking directly at her with encouraging eyes, introducing her as a new member. The room turned toward Natalie, and panic seized her throat. She could not reveal her mistake now. That would be worse than anything. Her hands trembled as she began speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. I am Natalie. 3 weeks ago, my relationship ended. We had been together for almost 5 years, and I gave everything to make it work. My time, my energy, every bit of myself. The words were technically true, if the relationship was with her business rather than a person. One morning, everything fell apart in front of everyone we knew. There was no privacy in my failure, no dignity in how it ended. She felt the tears building behind her eyes, but forced them back. My partner said I was not enough, that I had made critical mistakes that could not be forgiven. They walked away, and I was left standing there with nothing but shame. The sound that shattered peace around the circle, heads nodded in understanding. Several people reached for tissues, but then, from the corner of the room, came a sound that made Natalie's blood freeze. Someone was laughing. She turned sharply to see a man who looked wildly out of place in this modest community center. Julian Westwood, though she did not know his name yet, sat with casual elegance in a chair that seemed too small for his frame. His charcoal suit probably cost more than 3 months of her former rent. His dark hair was styled with careless perfection, and his hazel eyes danced with barely suppressed amusement. Beside him sat a younger woman, perhaps his sister, whose expression showed pure mortification. The breaking point, Julian tried to compose himself, but failed. I apologize, he said, though laughter still edged his voice. But did you actually just compare losing your business to being left at the altar? His words cut through the room like a knife. Every head swiveled between Natalie and Julian. Her metaphor was exposed, her carefully constructed story transparent to this stranger who had somehow seen through her words. Margaret stepped forward quickly, her voice sharp. "Julian, please. Everyone's pain is valid here." But something inside Natalie snapped. She had endured 3 weeks of pitying looks, whispered conversations, and crushing self-doubt. She would not tolerate mockery from a wealthy stranger, who clearly had never struggled a day in his life. Standing her ground, she stood abruptly, and her tote bag tumbled to the floor, spilling its contents across the worn carpet. Her phone, lip balm, a small jade plant she kept for luck, and several overdue bills scattered everywhere. "Perfect," she muttered bitterly, kneeling to gather her belongings. Julian rose immediately, his expression shifting to something that looked almost like regret. He moved toward her, but Natalie held up her hand sharply. "Do not," she said, her voice cutting. "You are absolutely right. Compared to being abandoned at the altar, my situation must seem hilarious." Her voice remained steady despite tears now streaming down her cheeks. "But here's what you clearly do not understand. That business was not just my career. It was my dream, my identity, my proof that I mattered. Losing it felt like losing myself. If that amuses you, then you have obviously never had to question your worth or wonder if you will ever be enough again." Walking away with dignity without waiting for a response, Natalie walked toward the door with as much composure as she could gather. Behind her, she heard Margaret's sharp rebuke and the murmur of disapproving voices, but she refused to look back. The autumn air hit her face as she pushed through the building's exit, cool and refreshing after the suffocating room. She made it to her car before the sobs came, great shaking breaths that seemed to tear through her entire body. She had come searching for support and found fresh humiliation instead. The universe, it seemed, was determined to break her completely. The moment that changed. And what Natalie did not know was that inside the community center, Julian Westwood stood frozen, staring at the door she had disappeared through. Margaret's angry words washed over him, but he barely registered them. All he could think about was the fire in Natalie's eyes as she had defended herself, the dignity with which she had gathered her scattered belongings, and the raw truth in her words that had struck him harder than any business competitor ever had. His cousin. Olivia touched his arm gently. "That was cruel, Julian," she said quietly, her disappointment clear. Julian ran his hand through his perfectly styled hair, disrupting it for the first time in months. "I know," he admitted, his voice rough with an emotion he could not identify. "I know." But what disturbed him most was not just his own terrible behavior. It was the fact that he could not stop thinking about the woman with fierce eyes and the small jade plant, who had walked away without a backward glance. For the first time in his carefully controlled life, Julian Westwood felt genuinely shaken, and he had no idea what to do about it. 6 days after the disastrous support group meeting, Natalie was sitting on her apartment floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes and rejection emails. She had been applying for jobs all week, anything from administrative assistant to coffee shop manager. Her savings would last another month at best. The late morning sun filtered through her small window, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny reminders of her suspended life. When the doorbell rang, she jumped. Nobody visited her anymore. Friends had slowly drifted away when her business collapsed, uncomfortable with her failure or simply too busy with their own successful lives. She approached the door cautiously and peered through the peephole. A delivery person stood, holding an enormous arrangement of white orchids and a small package. Natalie opened the door carefully, accepted the delivery, and carried everything inside. The orchids were stunning, far more expensive than anything she could afford. But it was the small package that caught her attention. Inside was a jade plant, healthier and more vibrant than the one she had dropped, nestled in a beautiful ceramic pot with delicate gold trim. Words that stirred emotions. Her hands trembled as she opened the attached card. The handwriting was elegant but masculine. "I was wrong. I am deeply sorry. Please allow me to explain. Julian Westwood." Below the signature was a phone number and an address she recognized as being in the most exclusive part of the city. Natalie stared at the card for a long moment. Part of her wanted to throw the entire arrangement in the trash. How dared this wealthy man think he could buy forgiveness with expensive flowers and a replacement plant? But another part of her, the part that had seen something flicker in his eyes before she left that room, hesitated. She set the card on her kitchen counter and tried to return to her job applications. But concentration was impossible. The orchids seemed to fill her tiny apartment with their presence, and the jade plant sat on her windowsill like a tiny green question mark, the knock that changed everything 3 hours later. Another knock came at her door. This time, when she looked through the peephole, her heart stopped. Julian Westwood stood in her hallway, looking decidedly less polished than he had at the support group. His hair was slightly disheveled, his tie was loosened, and he carried a bag from a local coffee shop that she knew made the best pastries in the neighborhood. Natalie considered not answering. She could pretend she was not home. But curiosity, and something else, something she refused to name, made her open the door. Julian looked genuinely surprised that she had answered. "Natalie Brooks," he said, and hearing her name in his voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. "I know I have no right to be here, but I could not stop thinking about what happened, about what I did. Please, just give me 5 minutes to apologize properly." The courage to listen Natalie crossed her arms, trying to maintain her anger, but something in his expression softened her slightly. He looked genuinely distressed, not at all like the arrogant man who had laughed at her pain. "You have 3 minutes," she said finally, "and we are talking out here in the hallway, not in my apartment." Julian nodded quickly, setting the coffee shop bag on the floor. "That is more than fair. Natalie, what I did at that support group was unforgivable. I have spent the last week trying to understand how I could be so cruel, so thoughtless." He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture she was learning meant he was uncomfortable. "The truth is, I was there because my cousin Olivia dragged me. She had been left at the altar 6 months ago, and she thought attending a support group would help her heal. She made me come for moral support." Natalie felt her anger waver slightly, but held firm. "That does not excuse mocking someone else's pain." "You are absolutely right," Julian agreed immediately. "There is no excuse. But I need you to understand something. When you spoke about losing your relationship, about how it felt like losing yourself, something inside me recognized that pain, and instead of acknowledging it, I laughed. I mocked you because it was easier than admitting I understood exactly what you meant." The walls began to crumble. Natalie studied his face, searching for signs of deception. But all she saw was raw honesty. "What do you mean you understood?" Julian looked down at his expensive shoes. 5 years ago, I lost my company. The business I had built from nothing, the thing that defined me. My business partner embezzled millions and disappeared, leaving me holding the responsibility for debts I did not create. I had to file for bankruptcy. I lost everything, including my reputation. Natalie felt her breath catch. This man, who looked like he had never struggled a day in his life, had experienced something remarkably similar to her own nightmare. "But you clearly recovered," she said, gesturing to his obviously expensive clothes. "I did," Julian admitted. "It took 3 years of working 80-hour weeks, of rebuilding from absolute zero. But the shame of that failure, the feeling that I had lost myself, that never fully goes away. When I heard you describe those exact feelings, it triggered something in me, and I responded in the worst possible way." An invitation to understanding, Natalie felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. She had been so alone in her pain, so convinced that nobody could understand the depth of her shame. Finding someone who had walked a similar path, even if he was the last person she expected, felt like discovering water in a desert. "Your 3 minutes are up," she said softly. But then she surprised herself by adding, "But I suppose you could come in for coffee." "The coffee you brought, I mean." It would be a waste to let good pastries go uneaten. The relief that flooded Julian's face was almost comical. "Thank you. I promise I will leave the moment you ask me to." Natalie opened her door wider and led him into her small apartment. She was acutely aware of how modest it was compared to where he probably lived. The second-hand furniture, the boxes she had not yet unpacked, the single dying plant on her windowsill that was not the beautiful jade he had sent, stories.
Ow.
Shared over coffee, Julian did not seem to notice or care about her humble surroundings. He carefully unpacked the coffee and pastries while Natalie found plates and napkins. They sat at her small kitchen table, and for a moment, silence hung between them. "Tell me about your business," Julian said finally. "What happened?" Natalie hesitated, then began to speak. She told him about Enchanted Moments event planning, about how she had started it with a small inheritance from her grandmother and a mountain of determination. She described the ceiling collapse at the Whitmore wedding, the viral video, the lawsuits that had drained every penny she had. As she spoke, tears slipped down her cheeks, but she did not stop. Julian listened without interrupting, his hazel eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow was not. When she finished, he reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his. "That was not your fault," he said firmly. "A venue's structural failure is not the responsibility of the event planner. You were made a scapegoat. Try telling that to social media," Natalie said bitterly. "Or to the judge who ruled against me." The truth begins to emerge. Julian's jaw tightened. What was the name of the venue? The Grandview Estate. But they declared bankruptcy shortly after the incident, so there's nobody left to hold accountable. Something flickered across Julian's face, an expression Natalie could not quite read. "Natalie, I need to tell you something, but I am afraid you are going to be angry with me again." Her heart began to race. "What did you do?" "After I left the support group, I could not stop thinking about you. I had my assistant research your story. I wanted to understand what really happened." He took a deep breath. The Grandview Estate was owned by a subsidiary of a larger property group. That property group was recently acquired by my company. When I discovered this 3 days ago, I had my legal team investigate the original incident. Natalie pulled her hand back, her earlier anger returning. "You investigated me. Who gave you the right to dig into my life?" "A shocking discovery, please. Let me finish," Julian said urgently. "My team found evidence that the Grandview Estate knew about the structural issues months before your event. They had received warnings from an inspector, but chose to keep hosting events anyway. The ceiling collapse was inevitable. It could have happened at any wedding, any event. You were simply unlucky enough to be there when it finally gave way." Natalie sat frozen, trying to process what he was saying. But the lawsuit, the judgment against me, was based on incomplete information. The original owners of the Grandview buried the inspector's reports before declaring bankruptcy. But those documents still exist in the property files. Natalie, you have grounds to appeal the judgment against you. More than that, you have grounds to sue for damages. Tears were streaming down Natalie's face now, but they were different tears. For the first time in months, they were not tears of shame, but of something else. Hope, perhaps, or vindication. "I cannot afford a lawyer. I can barely afford groceries." Julian leaned forward, his voice gentle but determined. "I will provide the lawyers. Consider it part of my apology. No strings attached. You deserve to have your name cleared." The beginning of something new. Natalie looked at this man who had entered her life in the worst possible way and was now offering her something she had thought was impossible. "Second chances," he had said. Maybe they were possible after all. "I do not understand you, Julian Westwood," she said softly. "You mocked me 1 week ago. Now you are offering to help rebuild my life. What do you want from me?" Julian met her eyes steadily. "Honestly, I do not know yet. Maybe a chance to prove I am not the terrible person you met at that support group. Maybe a chance to help someone the way I wish someone had helped me when I lost everything." Or maybe he paused, vulnerability crossing his handsome features. "Maybe I just want to get to know the woman who had the courage to stand up to me when I was being cruel." Natalie felt something shift in her chest, a crack in the armor she had built around her heart. "This does not mean I forgive you completely," she warned. "I would not expect you to," Julian replied. "But maybe it is a start." As the afternoon sun moved across her small apartment, casting new shadows and new light, Natalie allowed herself to believe that perhaps the universe was not finished testing her. Perhaps it was offering her something unexpected instead. A second chance, not just at her career, but at trust, at connection, at something that felt dangerously close to hope. 3 months had passed since. Julian first knocked on Natalie's apartment door. The legal team he had provided worked tirelessly, and the evidence they uncovered was overwhelming. The judge had overturned the original ruling, clearing Natalie's name completely. The story had even made local news, with several journalists praising her resilience and exposing the negligence of the Grandview Estate's former owners. During those 3 months, something else had happened. Something Natalie had not expected and certainly had not been looking for. Julian had become a constant presence in her life. Coffee meetings turned into long dinners. Business discussions evolved into conversations about dreams, fears, and the pieces of themselves they had lost and were slowly reclaiming. Natalie found herself laughing again. Something she had thought might be impossible. Julian was different from the man she had met at the support group. He was thoughtful, surprisingly funny, and carried his own scars with a quiet dignity that made her respect him deeply. The unexpected opportunity. In a crisp January morning, Natalie received a call that made her heart race. Victoria Chen, one of the most prominent wedding planners in the state, wanted to meet with her. Natalie had admired Victoria's work for years, had studied her events like a student learning from a master. They met at an elegant cafe downtown. Victoria got straight to the point. "Natalie, I have been following your story. What happened to you was an injustice, but how you handled it showed remarkable character. I am expanding my business and looking for a partner, someone with your talent and determination. I want you to consider joining me." Natalie could barely breathe. This was beyond anything she had hoped for. A partnership with Victoria Chen would not just rebuild her career, it would elevate it to heights she had only dreamed about. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. Victoria smiled warmly. "Say yes. But there is something you should know. This opportunity came about because someone reached out to me on your behalf. Someone who spoke very highly of your abilities and provided documentation of your work. Julian Westwood contacted me 2 months ago." The discovery that shook her world. Natalie felt her stomach drop. Julian had done this? He had orchestrated this opportunity without telling her. She thanked Victoria and promised to call with her answer. But her mind was spinning as she left the cafe. She drove directly to Julian's office, something she had never done before. His assistant tried to stop her, but Natalie walked past with determination born of confusion and hurt. She pushed open his office door without knocking. Julian looked up from his desk, surprise and something like fear crossing his face when he saw her expression. "Natalie, what happened?" "You contacted Victoria Chen about me," she said, her voice shaking. "You arranged this opportunity without telling me. What else have you been doing behind my back, Julian? What else have you manipulated?" Julian stood slowly, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Please, let me explain." "I am tired of explanations," Natalie said, tears threatening. "I thought we had built something honest. But you have been pulling strings like I am some project you need to fix. Did you ever actually care about me, or was I just another broken thing for the wealthy Julian Westwood to repair so he could feel better about himself?" The truth that changes everything. Julian's face went pale. "That is not fair, and you know it." "Yes, I contacted Victoria. Yes, I wanted to help you. But everything between us has been real, Natalie. You have to believe that. How can I believe anything when you keep secrets from me?" Natalie's voice broke. "I trusted you, Julian. After everything that happened, after all my walls came down, I trusted you." Julian moved around his desk, his expression desperate. "You want the truth?" "The whole truth." "Then sit down, because there is something I have been trying to find the right time to tell you. Something that connects us in a way I never expected." Natalie sank into a chair, her anger mixing with confusion. Julian sat across from her, taking a deep breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. 5 years ago, when I lost my company, I told you my business partner embezzled money and disappeared. What I did not tell you was his name. Thomas Grant. Does that name mean anything to you?" Natalie felt the blood drain from her face. "Thomas Grant was my ex-boyfriend. We dated right before I started my business. He disappeared 4 years ago, and I never knew where he went." The shocking connection revealed. Julian nodded slowly. "Thomas was my best friend and business partner. We built Westwood Properties together from nothing. When he embezzled from the company, he did not just steal money. He stole client investments, retirement funds, everything. He He destroyed lives, Natalie, including mine. Natalie's mind was racing, pieces clicking into place. You knew who I was. When you saw me at the support group, you knew I had dated Thomas. No, Julian said urgently. I swear I did not. I only discovered the connection when I had my assistant research your background. When I saw his name in your past, I almost walked away from everything. But by then, I had already fallen for you, Natalie. I knew I had to tell you, but I was terrified you would blame me for what Thomas did to both of us. Natalie stood abruptly, pacing his office. This is too much. The man who ruined your life dated me. The man who disappeared, owing me thousands of dollars that I borrowed for my business, destroyed your company. We are connected through the worst person either of us has ever known. Love emerging from pain, yes, Julian said quietly, standing to face her. We are connected through Thomas's destruction. But we are also connected through something else. Our ability to survive. Our determination to rebuild. Our courage to try again, even when the world knocked us down. He took a step closer. Natalie, when I laughed at you in that support group, it was not cruelty. It was recognition. I saw my own pain reflected in your eyes, and it terrified me, because I thought I had buried those feelings forever. Tears were streaming down Natalie's face now. You should have told me about Thomas weeks ago. You're absolutely right. I was a coward. I was so afraid of losing what we had built together that I kept putting it off, waiting for the perfect moment that never came. Julian's voice was raw with emotion. But I need you to understand something. Yes, I contacted Victoria Chen. Yes, I wanted to help rebuild your career. But I did it because I believe in your talent, not because I was trying to control you. And everything between us, every conversation, every moment, has been completely real. The choice that defines everything, Natalie. That this man who had entered her life through mockery and stayed through honesty. The man who had been destroyed by the same person who had hurt her. The man who had somehow become essential to her healing. I am furious with you for keeping this secret, she said finally. But I understand why you were afraid. Thomas hurt both of us in different ways. He stole from both of us. But Julian, we cannot build something real if we are hiding things from each other. I know, Julian said, reaching out to take her hands. No more secrets. I promise you. Ask me anything, and I will tell you the truth, no matter how difficult. Natalie squeezed his hands, feeling the warmth and strength there. Did you manipulate Victoria Chen, or did you genuinely recommend me based on my abilities? I sent her your portfolio and told her about your work. The decision to offer you a partnership was entirely hers. I swear on everything I have, Natalie. I would never diminish your talent that way. The resolution that heals something inside Natalie relaxed, a tension she had been carrying finally releasing. I believe you. I do not fully understand this connection between us yet. I do not understand how two people, broken by the same man, could find each other in a random support group. But I know what I feel when I am with you. I know that for the first time since my world fell apart, I feel whole again. Julian pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. Thomas took so much from both of us. But maybe, in some strange way, his destruction created the path that led us to each other. We understand each other's pain in a way nobody else could. Natalie pulled back to look into his eyes. I am taking Victoria's partnership offer. Not because you arranged it, but because I earned it. And I'm giving us a real chance. Not because you tried to fix me, but because somewhere between your terrible first impression and now, I fell in love with you. Julian's face transformed with joy and relief. I fell in love with you the moment you stood up to me holding that tiny jade plant like a shield. I just did not have the courage to admit it until now. Future built on truth 6 months later. Natalie stood in the grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel, watching as 200 guests celebrated a wedding she and Victoria had planned together. The event was flawless, a stunning display of elegance and joy that would surely become another viral video. But this time for all the right reasons. Julian stood at the edge of the room, watching her work with undisguised admiration. When she caught his eye, he smiled, and she felt that now familiar warmth spread through her chest. They had built something unexpected from the ruins of their separate disasters. Something honest, something strong, something that felt like coming home. As the night drew to a close and the last guests departed, Julian approached her with a small box in his hand. "I know this might seem fast," he said, his voice nervous in a way that made her love him even more. "But we've already survived the worst separately. I want to face everything else together." Natalie opened the box to find a simple, elegant ring. Not ostentatious, not designed to impress, but perfect in its understated beauty. Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at him. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, to facing everything together. Yes, to building something beautiful from the broken pieces. Yes to you, Julian Westwood." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Natalie thought about that terrible day in the support group, about the mockery that had somehow led to this moment. Sometimes the worst beginnings led to the most beautiful endings. Sometimes the people who hurt us could also teach us to heal. And sometimes love emerged not in spite of pain, but because two broken souls recognized each other and chose to rebuild together. Their story was not perfect, but it was real, honest, and entirely theirs.